Over the decades, some record labels became more than businesses. They became empires. Some were built around artists who came from dangerous environments. Others became entangled in bitter rivalries and criminal investigations. And in a few cases, the people running the business became almost as famous as the musicians themselves. But how much of the mythology was real? And how much was created by the music industry, the media, and the artists themselves? In this documentary, we're looking at 8 record labels surrounded by some of the most controversial stories in music history. These aren't simply stories about records and royalties. They're stories about ambition, fame, conflict, and the enormous price that sometimes comes with success. And we're beginning with one of the most infamous names of them all, the Death Row Records. In the early 1990s, something extraordinary was happening in American music. Hip-hop was no longer confined to a handful of neighborhoods or underground scenes. It was becoming a cultural force. And on the West Coast, one record label was preparing to dominate the industry. Its name was Death Row Records. Founded in 1991 by Dr. Dre, Suge Knight, the DOC, and producer Dick Griffey, Death Row emerged from the Los Angeles hip-hop scene. But from the beginning, the label carried an image that was different from the polished corporate world of traditional record companies. Its music was aggressive, its artists spoke openly about street life, and its executives projected an image of power that made Death Row feel less like an ordinary record label and more like an independent kingdom. Then came Dr. Dre's The Chronic. The album became a massive commercial success and introduced millions of listeners to a new sound coming from the West Coast. Death Row had arrived, and its next major star would become one of the most recognizable rappers in the world, Snoop Dogg. His debut album, Doggy Style, became a phenomenon. Suddenly, Death Row wasn't just successful. It was one of the most powerful labels in hip-hop. But behind the success, tensions were already developing. Dr. Dre eventually left the company, and as Death Row's influence grew, Suge Knight became increasingly central to its identity. Knight was a towering figure in the industry. He was known for his intimidating personality and his aggressive approach to business. Stories about confrontations involving Death Row circulated widely. Some were documented. Others became part of the mythology surrounding the label. And that distinction matters, because over time, Death Row became surrounded by so many stories that separating verified events from legend became increasingly difficult. Then, in 1995, another major figure entered the picture, Tupac Shakur. At the time, Tupac was facing serious legal troubles and had become increasingly frustrated with the music industry. After being released from prison, he signed with Death Row Records. The partnership changed hip-hop. Tupac quickly became the face of the label, and Death Row became associated with one of the most intense rivalries in music history, the East Coast versus West Coast conflict. At the center of the rivalry were Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records, the New York-based label led by Sean Puffy Combs. Artists exchanged insults through songs and interviews. Personal disagreements became public, and the media increasingly portrayed the conflict as a battle between two opposing sides of hip-hop. But the rivalry wasn't simply about music. It involved personal relationships, business disputes, and real-world tensions, and the consequences would eventually become devastating. In September 1996, Tupac Shakur attended a boxing match in Las Vegas. Later that night, while riding in a car, he was shot. He was taken to the hospital. Several days later, Tupac died. He was only 25 years old. His death sent shockwaves through the music industry, and Death Row would never be the same. Tupac had been the label's biggest star. His death removed one of the most important forces holding the company together. But the problems didn't stop there. Death Row faced financial difficulties, legal battles, and internal disputes. Artists began leaving. The company's influence weakened, and Suge Knight eventually faced serious legal problems of his own. The empire that had once seemed almost untouchable was collapsing. By the end of the 1990s, the golden era of Death Row Records was effectively over. but its cultural impact remained enormous. Death Row helped define the sound and image of West Coast hip-hop. It launched and elevated some of the biggest artists of the era. And it demonstrated just how powerful a record label could become when music, personality, celebrity, and street culture collided. But there is another side to the Death Row story. The label became so associated with violence and intimidation that its reputation sometimes overshadowed its music. For some people, Death Row represented independence from the traditional music industry. For others, it represented the dangers of allowing business rivalries and personal conflicts to become intertwined with an entertainment empire. And perhaps that is what makes Death Row's story so fascinating. It wasn't simply a record label that became successful. It became a symbol of an entire era. An era when hip-hop was transforming from a cultural movement into a billion-dollar industry. But the transformation came with consequences. Tupac was gone. Dr. Dre had moved on. Snoop Dogg had built a career beyond the label. And Death Row's empire was falling apart. Yet the name survived. Because decades later, people still remember Death Row Records. Not just for the albums, not just for the artists, but for everything that happened around them. The story of Death Row is ultimately a story about power. And power can create incredible success. But when that power is mixed with rivalry, money, fame, and unresolved conflict, the consequences can reach far beyond the recording studio. And Death Row wasn't the only label to find itself at the center of controversy. Our next case takes us back to Compton, where a group of young artists would create music that changed America, and put their record label directly in the middle of one of hip-hop's most controversial eras. Next, Ruthless Records. In the late 1980s, a group of young artists from Compton, California, began creating music that sounded unlike anything coming from mainstream America. Their lyrics were raw, their stories were confrontational, and their view of life in the streets was impossible for audiences to ignore. At the center of it all was a record label called Ruthless Records, founded in 1986 by Eric Wright, better known as Eazy-E, and music manager Jerry Heller. Ruthless Records would become one of the most influential independent labels in hip-hop history. But its rise would also place it at the center of controversy, censorship battles, industry disputes, and one of the most important cultural conflicts of the late 20th century. The story began with a group called NWA. NWA, or Niggas Wit Attitudes, brought together Eazy-E, Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, MC Ren, and DJ Yella. Their music reflected the environment they came from. They spoke about poverty, police relations, gang culture, drugs, discrimination, and the realities of growing up in parts of Los Angeles that many Americans knew little about. Their approach was deliberately provocative, and it worked. In 1988, NWA released Straight Outta Compton. The album became a landmark in hip-hop. It wasn't simply successful. It became a cultural confrontation. One of its most controversial songs attracted enormous attention because of its aggressive criticism of police. Law enforcement organizations condemned the group's music. Politicians criticized the lyrics. Parents and commentators debated whether the music was dangerous or whether it was simply reflecting realities that society preferred not to discuss. The controversy made NWA even more famous. But behind the public attention, tensions were developing inside Ruthless Records. Money became an issue, contracts became an issue, and relationships between the members of NWA began to deteriorate. Ice Cube left the group in 1989. His departure created a major fracture. Then came another major development. Dr. Dre began having problems with Ruthless Records and Jerry Heller. Eventually, Dre left and helped establish Death Row Records with Suge Knight. And suddenly, two of the most important figures in Ruthless Records were gone. But Eazy-E wasn't finished. He continued building Ruthless Records and developing new artists. The label remained an important force in hip-hop. But the rivalry between Eazy-E and Dr. Dre became one of the defining conflicts of the era. Diss tracks followed. Accusations were exchanged. and fans watched as former collaborators turned into rivals. What made the conflict particularly significant was that it wasn't simply an argument between two rappers. These were businessmen. They controlled competing record labels, and both labels were connected to artists who were becoming increasingly influential. The competition helped create some of the most memorable moments in hip-hop history. But behind the music were real disputes over contracts, money, ownership, and personal relationships. And then came another devastating chapter. In 1995, Eazy-E announced that he had been diagnosed with HIV. The news shocked the music industry. At the time, HIV and AIDS were surrounded by enormous fear, misinformation, and stigma. Eazy-E's condition deteriorated rapidly. On March 26, 1995, Eric Wright died from complications related to AIDS. He was only 30 years old. His death marked the end of an extraordinary but turbulent chapter in hip-hop. Ruthless Records continued after his death, but the company would never have the same presence it had during its most influential years. Yet its legacy remained. Ruthless Records had helped create a new model for independent hip-hop. It demonstrated that artists from communities largely ignored by mainstream entertainment could build their own platforms and reach millions of people. But it also showed the dangers of rapid success. Contracts, ownership, money, and loyalty could become just as important as the music itself. And the story of Ruthless Records also raises a larger question. When artists describe violence, poverty, and conflict in their music, are they glorifying those realities? Or are they documenting them? That debate surrounded NWA for decades. Critics argued that the group's music could influence young people negatively. Supporters argued that the group was exposing social problems that had been ignored for generations. Either way, Ruthless Records had changed the conversation. It helped move West Coast hip-hop from a regional movement into a national phenomenon, and its influence can still be heard in music today. But the label's story also reveals something darker about the music business. Success can create enormous wealth. Fame can create enormous power. But when business relationships begin breaking down, former friends can become competitors, and competitors can become enemies. Ruthless Records helped launch one of the greatest eras in hip-hop. But its history was filled with the same ingredients that would later define so many controversial labels: money, power, loyalty, betrayal, and the struggle to control an industry that was becoming bigger by the day. And while Ruthless Records was fighting to control the West Coast sound, another label was building an empire of its own, an empire that would eventually become one of the most commercially successful forces in hip-hop. Its name was No Limit Records. In the 1990s, hip-hop was changing rapidly. What had once been considered a niche form of music was becoming a massive commercial industry. And while major record companies were beginning to recognize the financial power of rap, one entrepreneur decided he didn't need them to build his own empire. His name was Percy Miller. Most people knew him as Master P, and the company he built was No Limit Records. Based in New Orleans, No Limit would become one of the most successful independent record labels in American music. But its rise was also surrounded by controversy, disputes, street imagery, and questions about how far an independent music empire could go. Master P didn't begin with the resources of the major record companies. He built No Limit around independence. Instead of simply signing artists and handing control to a traditional music company, he developed a system that allowed No Limit to control much of its own business: music, distribution, marketing, merchandise, and eventually, even film and television projects. The strategy was remarkably effective. No Limit's distinctive album covers, often featuring military tanks and aggressive imagery, became instantly recognizable. Then came the artists: Silk the Shocker, Mia X, C Murder, Mystikal, and a long list of other performers who helped turn No Limit into a national brand. The label's sound was heavily influenced by Southern hip-hop, but it was marketed across the United States. Albums were arriving constantly, And No Limit's business model allowed Master P to release an extraordinary amount of music. At the height of its success, the company was moving millions of records. Master P wasn't simply trying to become a successful rapper. He was building a corporation, and that was part of what made No Limit so different. But the label's image was also controversial. Many of its artists used violent and explicit themes in their music. The imagery surrounding the company often emphasized guns, street credibility, wealth, and power. Critics argued that the music contributed to the glorification of criminal lifestyles. Supporters saw it differently. To them, No Limit represented entrepreneurial independence. Master P had taken a small operation and transformed it into a multi-million-dollar entertainment business, without relying entirely on the traditional music establishment. But behind the success were growing problems. As No Limit expanded, disagreements emerged between Master P and some of the artists associated with the label. One of the most serious controversies involved C. Murder, Master P's brother. In 2002, C. Murder was convicted of second-degree murder in connection with the shooting death of a 16-year-old fan at a nightclub in Louisiana. He maintained his innocence. The case became controversial, with questions later raised about aspects of the prosecution and witness testimony. C. Murder's legal battle continued for years. His case became another example of how the world surrounding No Limit could extend far beyond music. But the label's story was not defined solely by controversy. No Limit also helped establish Southern hip-hop as a dominant commercial force. Before the 1990s, the biggest centers of American hip-hop were often associated with New York and Los Angeles. No Limit helped prove that an independent company from New Orleans could compete nationally. And that achievement changed the music industry. Master P demonstrated that an artist didn't necessarily need to wait for a major label to give them permission to build a successful career. He created his own infrastructure. He negotiated his own deals. He developed his own artists. And he turned the No Limit name into a brand that extended far beyond music. But success at that scale can be difficult to maintain. By the late 1990s, No Limit's dominance began to decline. The music industry was changing. Artists were leaving. Sales were changing. And the enormous output that had helped make No Limit successful also created challenges. The empire that had seemed unstoppable began losing some of its momentum. Still, the impact of No Limit Records was undeniable. Master P had changed the way artists thought about ownership. He showed that a musician could become an entrepreneur, that a record label could become a lifestyle brand, and that Southern hip-hop could compete with the biggest names in the country. But the No Limit story also demonstrates the complicated relationship between music and image. When an artist builds a brand around power, violence, wealth, and street credibility, that image can become difficult to separate from the real people behind it. And when controversies emerge outside the studio, the public begins asking a difficult question: where does the entertainment end? And reality begin? No Limit Records may have started as a small independent label in New Orleans, but for a brief period in the 1990s, it became one of the biggest forces in American hip-hop. It created stars. It generated enormous amounts of money. It challenged the major labels, and it helped transform the business of rap music. But as No Limit's empire began to change, another Southern label was preparing to become even more influential. This next company would help launch some of the biggest stars in hip-hop history. It would dominate the music business for decades, and its name would become synonymous with money, power, and controversy. That label was Cash Money Records. Southern hip-hop was no longer something the rest of America could ignore. New Orleans had developed its own sound, its own culture, and its own growing audience. And at the center of that movement was a record label founded by two brothers, Brian Williams, better known as Birdman, and Ronald Williams, known as Slim. Together, they built Cash Money Records. What began as a local independent operation would eventually become one of the most successful labels in hip-hop history. But behind the money and the platinum records was a story filled with business disputes. contract controversies, artist departures, and questions about who really controlled the empire. Cash Money Records was founded in New Orleans in 1991. In its early years, the label focused heavily on the local southern rap scene. Artists such as BG, Juvenile, Turk, and Lil Wayne would eventually become the foundation of what became known as the Hot Boys. And the Hot Boys changed everything. Their music brought the energy of New Orleans directly into the national spotlight. But Cash Money's biggest breakthrough came when the label secured a distribution agreement with Universal Records. The deal gave Cash Money access to the resources of a major record company, while allowing the Williams brothers to maintain significant control over their label. It was a powerful combination. Suddenly, a company that had started in New Orleans was competing on the same level as some of the biggest names in the music industry. Juvenile's album 400 Degrees became a massive success. Then came BG, Turk, and a young artist who would eventually become one of the biggest rappers of his generation. His name was Lil Wayne. Wayne had joined Cash Money while he was still a teenager. At first, he was one member of the Hot Boys. But over time, his role became much bigger. As the other members of the group pursued their own careers, Wayne remained with Cash Money. Eventually, he became the label's biggest star. But success created problems. Several Cash Money artists began having disputes with the label over money and contracts. BG left. Juvenile left. Turk eventually left as well. The Hot Boys were no longer together, and the departures raised questions about the business structure behind Cash Money's enormous success. Were the artists being compensated fairly? Who controlled the masters? Who owned the music? And how much money was actually reaching the artists? These questions would become even more important when Lil Wayne began experiencing his own disputes with Cash Money. By the late 2000s, Wayne was one of the biggest artists in the world. He had created Young Money Entertainment, an imprint connected to Cash Money. And through Young Money, he helped launch the careers of artists including Drake and Nicki Minaj. That made Wayne incredibly valuable. But it also made disagreements over business arrangements even more significant. In the early 2010s, tensions between Lil Wayne and Cash Money became increasingly public. Wayne complained about delays involving his highly anticipated album Thaw Carter V. Eventually, he filed a lawsuit against Cash Money and Birdman, seeking millions of dollars and arguing over contractual obligations. The dispute became one of the biggest artist-label battles in modern hip-hop. For years, fans watched as the relationship between Wayne and Birdman deteriorated. At one point, the two had been portrayed almost like family. Now they were fighting in court. The dispute was eventually resolved, and Wayne's relationship with Cash Money changed dramatically. But the controversy had already raised broader questions about the traditional relationship between artists and record labels. Cash Money had demonstrated the enormous financial opportunities available in hip-hop, but it also demonstrated how complicated those relationships could become when millions of dollars were involved. And Cash Money's controversial history wasn't limited to contracts. The label's artists often built their music around themes of crime, violence, poverty, and street life. That led to the same debate that had surrounded other hip-hop labels. Were these artists glorifying criminal behavior, or were they documenting the environment they came from? There was no simple answer. For many listeners, the music was storytelling. For critics, the imagery could be dangerous. But regardless of the debate, Cash Money had achieved something extraordinary. It had helped turn New Orleans into one of the most important centers of hip-hop. It had created major stars. It had generated enormous amounts of money. And it had helped change the way independent labels negotiated with major corporations. The Cash Money story is ultimately a story about control. Control over music, control over money, control over artists, and control over an empire. Birdman and Slim had built something that many people thought was impossible. They had taken a local label and turned it into a global brand, but maintaining that empire became increasingly difficult as the people who helped build it began demanding more control over their own careers. And that is one of the most important lessons in the history of the music industry. A record label can create a superstar, but once that superstar becomes powerful enough, the balance of power can change. Cash Money survived those conflicts, but its story showed that even the most successful music empire can be threatened from within. And as the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, another label was building its own empire in New York. Its founder would become one of the most powerful figures in entertainment. Its biggest artist would become one of the most influential rappers of all time, and its history would eventually become connected to one of the most famous unsolved murders in American music, the Bad Boy Records. The music was becoming bigger, the artists were becoming richer, and record labels were becoming powerful businesses. But one label in particular would rise from the streets of New York and become one of the most influential forces in the music industry. Its name was Bad Boy Records. The man behind it was Sean Combs, then widely known as Puff Daddy. Combs had worked in the music business before creating Bad Boy. He had experience as an executive, a talent scout, and a producer. But in 1993, he decided to build something of his own. Bad Boy Records was born. And almost immediately, the label began attracting attention. One of its first major stars was Christopher Wallace. The world would come to know him as the Notorious B.I.G., or simply Biggie. Biggie came from Brooklyn and possessed a storytelling ability that separated him from many of his contemporaries. His lyrics painted pictures of street life, ambition, wealth, danger, and survival. But what made him particularly powerful was the way he delivered those stories. He could sound intimidating one moment and reflective the next. With Bad Boy behind him, Biggie became a superstar. His debut album, Ready to Die, established him as one of the most important rappers of his generation. And Bad Boy Records was suddenly competing with the biggest labels in America. But the success also placed the company directly in the middle of an increasingly bitter rivalry. On the opposite side of the country was Death Row Records. And Death Row had Tupac Shakur. What began as competition between two major music camps gradually became one of the most controversial rivalries in hip-hop history. Bad Boy represented the East Coast. Death Row represented the West Coast. And the artists associated with both sides increasingly exchanged insults through interviews and music. Tupac became convinced that people connected to Bad Boy had been involved in a previous attack against him in New York. Those allegations were strongly disputed. But Tupac's suspicion became an important part of the growing rivalry. Songs became responses to other songs. Personal disagreements became public. And the media increasingly portrayed the conflict as if hip-hop itself had been divided into two opposing armies. But the reality was more complicated. Not every artist on the East Coast hated every artist on the West Coast. Many musicians continued working across regional boundaries. Still, the rivalry had become powerful enough to shape the public image of the entire industry. And at the center of the East Coast side was Bad Boy Records. Then came September 1996. Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas. He died several days later. The music industry was devastated, and the rivalry became even more intense. But only 6 months later, another tragedy struck. On March 9, 1997, Christopher Wallace was in Los Angeles. He had attended a party connected to the music industry. While sitting in an SUV, he was shot. He was rushed to a hospital, but he died shortly afterward. Biggie was only 24 years old. Two of the biggest stars in hip-hop had now been killed within months of each other. Tupac on the West Coast, Biggie on the East Coast. The deaths transformed the rivalry into one of the darkest chapters in music history, and both murders remained unsolved for decades. That uncertainty created countless theories. Some blamed rival artists. Some pointed toward gang connections. Others alleged that people within the music industry knew more than they admitted. But many of those theories remain unproven. What is certain is that Biggie's death changed Bad Boy Records forever. The label had lost its biggest star, and Sean Combs suddenly had to continue building the company without the artist who had helped define it. Combs continued his career as a performer and businessman. Bad Boy produced more successful artists and became an important part of mainstream American entertainment. But Biggie's presence remained central to the label's identity. His music continued selling, his influence continued growing, and his death became part of the mythology surrounding the golden era of hip-hop. Bad Boy's history also reflects another important transformation. Hip-hop was no longer simply a genre, it was becoming a global business. Artists were becoming entrepreneurs, record executives were becoming celebrities, and music labels were becoming entertainment empires. But with that power came enormous pressure. Money created competition, fame created rivalries, and personal disagreements could become public battles. Bad Boy Records survived the loss of Biggie and continued to evolve, but its history would always be connected to one of the most important and tragic periods in hip-hop. The story of Bad Boy isn't simply about a record label, it's about ambition, it's about competition, it's about the enormous influence music can have on culture, and it's about how quickly that success can become overshadowed by tragedy. Two young men stood at the center of hip-hop's greatest rivalry. Tupac Shakur was 25 when he died. The notorious B.I.G. was only 24. Their careers were short. Their influence was enormous. And their deaths left questions that continue to surround the music industry decades later. But Bad Boy was only one side of that rivalry. Our next label takes us back to the West Coast, where another company became associated with some of the most controversial artists and business disputes in hip-hop. And unlike Bad Boy, its story would involve accusations of organized crime connections, federal investigations, and a name that seemed almost designed to provoke controversy. That label was Murder, Inc. Records. The biggest artists were becoming global celebrities. Record labels were becoming powerful businesses. And the line between music, image, money, and street culture was becoming increasingly difficult to separate. In New York, one new record label was about to become one of the most successful names in hip-hop and R&B. Its name was Murder Incorporated Records. The company was founded in 1999 by brothers Irv Gotti and Chris Gotti. The name itself was deliberately provocative. It was inspired by the historical nickname Murder, Inc., associated with organized crime in New York during the 1930s and 1940s. But the record label was a music business, not a criminal organization. Still, the name immediately attracted attention, and as the company became more successful, that provocative image would become increasingly important to its story. One of Murder Incorporated Records' biggest early stars was Jeffrey Atkins, better known as Ja Rule. Ja Rule had a distinctive style. He could move between aggressive rap and melodic R&B, creating songs that appealed to both hip-hop and mainstream audiences. His success helped transform Murder Incorporated Records from a young independent label into a major force in popular music. Then came Ashanti. She became one of the label's biggest stars. Her voice appeared on numerous major hits, including collaborations with Ja Rule, and her debut album became a major commercial success. For a period, Murder Incorporated Records seemed almost unstoppable. Ja Rule was dominating the charts. Ashanti was becoming a major R&B star, and Irv Gotti was establishing himself as one of the most influential executives and producers in the industry. But the label's provocative name and connections within the New York music scene eventually attracted attention from federal investigators. Authorities began examining alleged financial connections between Murder Incorporated Records and Kenneth Supreme McGriff, a convicted drug trafficker from Queens. The investigation focused on allegations that criminal proceeds had been used to finance or support aspects of the music business. These were serious allegations, and they placed the company under enormous scrutiny. In 2003, federal authorities raided Murder Incorporated Records offices. The image of a successful music company suddenly being investigated by federal agents made headlines across the country. The story became larger than the music. It raised questions about whether the record industry was sometimes being used to move or disguise illegal money. Irv Gotti and Chris Gotti were eventually indicted on money laundering charges. But there is an important distinction between being accused and being convicted. In 2005, both brothers were acquitted. The jury did not find them guilty of the charges. For Murder Incorporated Records, however, the damage to its public image was significant. The company had spent years building a reputation around power, success, and an intentionally intimidating name. Now that same image was being examined through the lens of a federal investigation. And while the legal battle was taking place, another conflict was developing in hip-hop. Ja Rule had become involved in a highly publicized rivalry with rapper 50 Cent. The feud became increasingly personal. Diss tracks were released. Public accusations were exchanged. And Murder Incorporated Records became closely associated with the conflict. 50 Cent eventually became one of the biggest stars in hip-hop, while Ja Rule's position in mainstream music began to weaken. At the same time, the music industry itself was changing. The sound of hip-hop was evolving, new artists were emerging, and the dominance that Murder Incorporated Records had enjoyed in the early 2000s became harder to maintain. Eventually, the company changed its name to The Inc. Records. The change helped distance the business from some of the controversy associated with the original name. But the history of Murder Incorporated Records remained. Its story had everything that made the era so dramatic. Massive commercial success, superstar artists, industry rivalries, federal investigations, and a provocative brand that became impossible to separate from the company's public identity. But one of the most important lessons from the Murder Incorporated Records story is the importance of separating allegations from proven facts. The label was investigated, its executives were charged. But Irv Gotti and Chris Gotti were acquitted of the money laundering charges. That doesn't erase the controversy, but it does provide important context. The music industry has always been fascinated by dangerous imagery. Artists use it. Record labels market it. Fans consume it. But when that imagery begins attracting the attention of law enforcement, the difference between image and reality becomes critically important. Murder Incorporated Records eventually faded from the center of mainstream music, but its artists left a lasting mark. Ja Rule became one of the most recognizable rappers of his generation. Ashanti became one of the defining R&B singers of the early 2000s. And Irv Gotti established himself as an important producer and executive. The label's rise was extraordinary. Its controversies were equally memorable. And its story showed once again that in the music business, a carefully designed image can become both an asset and a liability. Because sometimes, the name you choose to build your empire can become the very thing the world remembers you for. But Murder Incorporated Records was not the only label whose reputation became connected to controversy. Our next case takes us into another chapter of hip-hop history, a label where street culture, business disputes, violence, and allegations of criminal connections would once again collide. And this time, the story would involve a company whose name became synonymous with the underground side of West Coast rap. The next label is Black Market Records. The West Coast hip-hop scene was expanding far beyond Los Angeles. Sacramento was developing its own sound, its own artists, and its own independent music scene. In 1989, Cedric Singleton founded a record label called Black Market Records. The label would become particularly associated with Sacramento's darker and more underground style of hip-hop. Among its most notable artists were X-Rated and Brotha Lynch Hung, two rappers whose music became known for extremely dark themes and controversial subject matter. Black Market Records wasn't a major corporate powerhouse like Universal or Sony. It was an independent label, and that independence was part of its appeal. The company provided a platform for artists whose music was often considered too controversial or too extreme for mainstream radio. In 1992, Black Market Records released X-rated Psychoactive featuring Brotha Lynch Hung. The following year, the label released Brotha Lynch Hung's 24 Deep. The project became the label's first release to appear on the Billboard R&B hip-hop chart. Then came Season of Da Sickness. Brotha Lynch Hung's reputation continued to grow, particularly among listeners drawn to underground horror-themed rap. But the music was controversial. His lyrics frequently dealt with disturbing fictional scenarios and violent imagery. That made him an influential figure within a particular corner of underground hip-hop, but it also contributed to the label's reputation as one of the darker names in independent rap. However, the biggest controversy surrounding Black Market Records wasn't simply about the music. It was about business. As the label grew, disputes developed between its owner and some of its artists. One of the most significant involved Brotha Lynch Hung. After releasing music through the label, Lynch became involved in a long-running disagreement with Cedric Singleton over rights to his back catalog. The dispute became increasingly complicated. At one point, Black Market Records released material associated with Lynch that he claimed had been released without his permission. The disagreement eventually became a major part of his relationship with the label. Lynch ultimately left Black Market Records in 2003. X-Rated also eventually departed after completing his contract. These disputes reflected a much larger problem in the music industry. For young artists, signing with a record label could provide access to recording facilities, distribution, promotion, and an audience. But contracts could also determine who controlled the music after it was created, who owned the recordings, who could release them, who received the profits, and what happened when an artist wanted to leave. Those questions were becoming increasingly important as independent hip-hop expanded. Black Market Records became an example of the complicated relationship between underground artists and the companies that helped distribute their work. But despite the controversies, the label left a lasting mark on Sacramento hip-hop. It helped introduce a regional sound to audiences outside California, and it provided a platform for artists who operated far outside the mainstream. That is an important part of the story. Not every controversial record label was dangerous because of criminal activity. Sometimes the controversy came from the music itself. Sometimes it came from business disputes. And sometimes it came from the reputation surrounding the people involved. Black Market Records became known for music that pushed boundaries. Its artists developed strong underground followings. And its releases helped establish Sacramento as a significant location in West Coast hip-hop. But the label's history also shows why artists need to understand the business side of music. A successful song can create fame. A successful album can create money. But the contract behind that music can determine who controls the work for years. Black Market Records survived its most turbulent periods and continued operating as an independent label. But the era that made it famous had already passed. The underground hip-hop landscape had changed. The internet was transforming how artists distributed music, and artists increasingly had ways to reach audiences without depending entirely on traditional record companies. Still, the legacy of Black Market Records remains. It represents a period when independent labels could build powerful regional movements without the backing of the biggest corporations in the world. And it reminds us that the history of controversial music isn't always about crime. Sometimes it's about creative freedom. Sometimes it's about creative freedom. Sometimes it's about creative freedom. And sometimes it's about what happens when an artist's vision collides with the company controlling the music. But there is still one final label on our list. A label whose story would bring together enormous wealth, celebrity, controversy, and allegations that attracted extraordinary public attention. The final chapter takes us back to one of the most powerful figures in modern music, and the story would become much bigger than a record label. The final record label. Death Row Records, The Empire After the Fall. Some record labels disappear when their biggest stars leave. Others disappear when the money runs out. But Death Row Records was different. Even after its empire collapsed, the name continued to carry enormous weight. By the late 1990s, the label that had once dominated West Coast hip-hop was struggling. Dr. Dre was gone. Snoop Dogg was gone. Tupac Shakur was dead. And Suge Knight, the man who had become the public face of Death Row, was facing serious legal problems. The company that had once seemed almost unstoppable was now fighting to survive. But the story of Death Row did not end with its collapse. It became something even more powerful, a legend. Death Row had helped create a new sound for West Coast hip-hop. It had turned artists into global celebrities, and it had demonstrated how much power an independent music company could have when it controlled artists, production, distribution, and branding. But the same aggressive culture that helped create the label's identity also contributed to its problems. Legal battles became increasingly common. Artists departed. Financial difficulties grew. And Death Row's relationship with the mainstream music industry became increasingly complicated. By the early 2000s, the company was a shadow of what it had once been. Then came another major development. In 2006, Suge Knight filed for bankruptcy. Death Row Records' assets were eventually placed under bankruptcy protection and later sold. For a label that had once represented enormous power, the collapse was dramatic. The company had gone from being one of the most valuable names in hip-hop to an asset being divided and sold. But the music remained. Tupac's recordings continued to generate enormous interest. The albums created during Death Row's golden era remained influential. And younger generations of artists continued studying the sound and style that the label had helped establish. The Death Row story also became a lesson about ownership. Who owns an artist's recordings? Who controls the catalog? Who profits from music decades after it was recorded? Those questions became increasingly important as the value of music catalogs exploded. And Death Row's catalog became one of the most recognizable collections in hip-hop. Years after the original label had collapsed, interest in Death Row returned. The brand was eventually acquired by new ownership, and in 2022, Snoop Dogg announced that he had acquired Death Row Records. For fans, the moment represented something almost symbolic. One of the artists who had helped make Death Row famous was now helping control its future. The label had come full circle, but its history remained complicated. Death Row Records had produced extraordinary music. It had created opportunities for artists. It had helped establish West Coast hip-hop as a dominant cultural force. But it was also surrounded by violence, legal disputes, financial problems, and unresolved questions. And that is why Death Row remains one of the most fascinating record labels in music history. Its story isn't simply about crime. It isn't simply about music. And it isn't simply about business. It's about what happens when all three worlds collide. A record label can begin with a dream. Artists want to be heard. Executives want to build a successful company. Fans want music that speaks to them. But when fame and money grow quickly, the stakes change. Friendships can become business relationships. Business relationships can become rivalries. And an image created for entertainment can sometimes become difficult to separate from reality. That is the story repeated throughout the 8 labels we've examined. Ruthless Records helped bring West Coast rap into the mainstream. No Limit Records demonstrated the power of independent entrepreneurship. Cash Money Records transformed Southern hip-hop into a global business. Bad Boy Records became one of the defining forces of East Coast hip-hop. Murder Incorporated Records became embroiled in federal scrutiny while producing major stars. Black Market Records helped give underground West Coast artists a platform. And Death Row Records became one of the most powerful and controversial labels the genre had ever seen. Their stories are different, but they share one common theme: power. The power to create stars. The power to control music. The power to influence culture. and sometimes the power to destroy the very empire that was built. The music industry has changed dramatically since the golden era of hip-hop. Streaming has transformed distribution. Social media has changed how artists build audiences, and independent musicians now have opportunities that previous generations could barely imagine. But the lessons from these record labels remain. Success isn't just about making great music. It's about contracts, ownership, trust, business decisions, and understanding what happens when enormous amounts of money and influence enter the picture. Because behind every famous song is a business. Behind every superstar is a contract. And behind some of the biggest music empires in history, there are stories that the public never saw. The question isn't simply which record label was the most dangerous. The more important question is this: what happens when the business of music becomes more powerful than the music itself? And perhaps that is the real story behind these 8 controversial record labels. Not just the fame, not just the money, but the price of power. If you think you've heard it all, think again. Subscribe now and uncover the stories they never wanted you to know.